old days of my youth, I recall My Two-Wheeled Catastrophe by Patrick F. McManus. When I was a kid, most of my friends had decent, well-mannered bicycles of distinct makes and models. Mine was a balloon-tired monster, poured halfway between the junkyard and the second-hand store. Some local feed had built it with his own 3 hands and sold it to my mother for about the price of a good milk cow. For 2 cents, or even a used jawbreaker, I would have gladly beaten it to death with a baseball bat. But I needed it. Transportation, then as now, was the name of the game. Perhaps the worst thing about the bike, as I called it within hearing range of my mother, was that you simply could not ride it in a manner that allowed you to retain any sense of dignity. The chief reason was that the seat was permanently adjusted for about a person of 6'8". I was a person of about 5'8". The handlebars suggested strongly that they had been stolen from a tricycle. The result of this unhappy combination was that wherever I rode on the bike, my rear was always 3 inches higher than my shoulder blades. The bike seat is the kind usually found on European racing bikes. To get the proper effect of it, you might try sitting a couple hours on the end of a baseball bat. The small end. Put a doily on it for cushioning. But I was the fastest thing around on 2 wheels, thanks to that bicycle seat. The bike did tricks with its chain. It waited until you had just started down a long, steep, winding hill when it would reach up with its chain and wind your pant leg into the sprocket. This move was doubly ingenious, since it not only prevented you from putting on the coaster brakes, but it also shackled you to a hurtling death machine. It would also throw off the chain just when you needed it most, which was usually when you were trying to outrun one of the timber wolves that the neighbors kept as watchdogs. Sometimes the front wheel would go for weeks without bouncing off. This was to lure you in a false sense of security. You'd be rattling along for home one day when, all of a sudden, for a split second, you saw the front wheel pulling away. Then the fork would hit the ground and whip you over the handlebars. Then before you could catch your breath, there was the wolf, sitting on your belly reading the menu. As much as I hated the bike, I'll have to admit, it could take you just about anywhere you had the nerve enough to pedal it. It could cross fallen logs, navigate streams, and crash through the brush. It was also the chief mode of transportation for my camping trips. Sometimes even today I see young people using bicycles for camping. They'd zip along in their 10-speed touring bike with all the camp gear in a neat little packet on the rear fender. When we went camping on our 1-speed bikes, it looked as if we had a baby elephant on the handlebars and the mother on behind. Loading the bike for a camping trip was a blatant defiance of all of the laws of physics. Our skillet alone weighed more than one of today's touring bikes. The tent was a tarp that served winters as a haystack cover. Most of our food was kept in the quart jars that our mothers had canned them in. And then there were all the axes, saws, hatchets, knives, and World War II surplus bayonets, without which no camping trip would be complete. The standard packing procedure was to dump most of your stuff in the center of the tarp, roll it up into a bundle, and tie it together with half-a-mile of rope. Then you found 9 boys and a man to lift it onto the rear fender of the bike. The rest of the stuff was rolled into a jungle hammock and tied to the diminutive handlebars. Then you sprang into the saddle and pedaled from all the fury you could generate from 98 pounds of bone and muscle. The bike would howl and rage, and the twin humps of camp gear would sway and shudder like a sick camel. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the whole catastrophe would wobble out of the yard and on down the road. Sometimes now when the cold awakens in my bones the aches of 1,000 old injuries, I recall in vivid detail the last few terrifying moments of the bike's existence as a recognizable entity. A ragged gypsy band of us had just struck off on another camping trip, and I was far out in the lead, hatchet-head bicycle seat urging me on. There's a hill about a mile from our house called Sand Creek Hill. By rights, it should have been called Dead Man's Drop or Widowmaker. I was strode down it with one foot on the running board another hand crunching a rosary. Even the atheists. Just as I had crested the hill and started my descent, who should I notice coming up from the bottom but one of the neighbor's wolves, apparently returning home after a long night of hunting elk in the mountains. Even from 50 yards away, I could see his face brighten as he caught sight of me, hurtling toward him like doom on wheels. Crouched expectantly, eyes happily agleam. The chain chose at that moment to eat my pant leg halfway up to the knee. The washboard road rattled my bones. I expected to be abandoned by the front wheel at any minute. Axes, saws, and hatchets filled the air on all sides. The great, straining mass of the rear pack threatened to collapse on me at any minute. With one last great effort, I aimed a swift kick at the wolf and threw myself into space. I bounced 4 times to distribute the injuries evenly about my body, and then, using my nose as a brake, I slid to a stop. Even the wolf was somewhat shaken by the impact of the crash. He stared in silent awe at the wreckage, almost forgetting about my one good leg, which he held in his slack jaw. When I was up and about again, my mother bought me a car. Some local fiend had built it with his own 3 hands, but that's another story.